We're Nippon Tradings International, or NTI for short, and what we do is we represent foreigners, meaning people who are either not resident in Japan or are in Japan but don't speak, read and write the language or just need a hand. We represent them in everything to do with real estate purchases, sales and management in Japan. So we can help them buy, put property managers, tenants in place, renovations, repairs, improve on the property, do development projects, sell it down the track, anything they want, whether they're physically here or not. So we can do everything remotely on their behalf. So in most cases, it's pretty similar to what you'd expect from property purchases overseas. You have a real estate agent listing the asset. You have a property lawyer who's handling the ownership transfer document, checking the validity of the title deed and so forth. You've got property managers and building management companies in place in case of tenanted properties or properties that are in condo units and have an owner union. And you have an insurance company, renovation, repair, tax department, the same sort of components that you have overseas. The only added complexity is in case you're buying one of the infamous akiya, which are abandoned properties in the Japanese countryside, abandoned or vacant, and there's also a government municipality involved, a local municipality involved, who is in charge of facilitating the purchases of these abandoned properties, and that just adds another stakeholder, if you will, to the process, and also complexity and length of time. So depending on the price of the properties, the cost would vary. For the cheapest properties on the markets, the one that you see advertised for anywhere between a few thousand to $50,000, say, if you're using a facilitator like us, which is required in these areas normally, it would cost a worst case of 20 or up to maybe 22, 23%. And the pricier the property is, the lower that percentage drops. Properties that are 100, 200,000 would normally cost a worst case of maybe 13, 14% in purchase costs. In essence, it's very similar to what you'd expect in other countries. There is a property listing, you submit an offer, negotiate the price, do viewings, inspections, structural inspections if you want to, and then once everyone is satisfied and moving forward, you sign the contract, pay a 10% deposit. It takes about a month to execute the ownership transfer documents, especially if they're coming in from overseas, like in the foreign buyer's case. And then at the end of that period, the property lawyer conducts the ownership transfer and the property is transferred over to the buyer's name. It does get more complex when you're dealing with, again, abandoned countryside type of sellers where the owner is either elderly and moved out or passed away and the property is being sold by their descendants. In those cases, again, there's going to be a government municipality involved who need to first approve you as a buyer before they'll even pass you on to the real estate agent for viewings and negotiations. No one involved in the process, in the case of most of these remote properties, has ever worked with a foreigner before, so they first need to wrap their head around how everything would work dealing with a foreign buyer on the other end, which is where middlemen or facilitators like us can help a lot. And also because, again, you're dealing with an elderly seller or their descendant, somebody who probably has not purchased or sold many properties in their lifetime, everything takes longer. Every response takes weeks to receive. Every document takes weeks to source or reproduce because they've never kept them. Zoning regulations and boundaries need to be reconfirmed, especially in cases where the property was built decades ago where these things were not even norm. It's a lengthy process. The cheaper and more rural the properties are, the more complex the process becomes. It's always possible, it's always doable, but it takes a lot of time and patience, and there are a lot of moving pieces involved. So viewings would normally work as you would expect if you are in Japan, speak the language, and can just schedule a viewing with a listing realtor and meet them at the property, take photos, videos, whatever you want. If you're not in Japan or do not speak the language, and again, in the case of most rural properties, the listing realtors will also not be able to deal directly with foreigners. In those cases, if somebody like us is involved and the realtor is tech savvy enough and open-minded enough, they can conduct a remote viewing for us, and we would be linking with you and with the realtor via Zoom to provide interpretation. In case the realtor is extremely old school, which is often the case, then we can go to the property, conduct a remote viewing on your behalf along the same lines. So structural inspections are definitely possible. You probably want to have them done if the property is getting too old in years, or if it's at a certain price point where it makes sense to evaluate how much you would need to further put into it. They normally cost between $500 to $1,500, depending on how large the property is and how accessible the various parts of it are, like the roof or the base. We would normally commission the inspection once an offer has been accepted. There's obviously no point in forking out that money if that's not going to be moving forward at all. So legally, there's nothing preventing you from doing that. However, Japan being Japan, everything here is very checkbox manners and proper conduct oriented, and submitting offers and then pulling them back without a valid concrete reason, which the realtor and the seller can easily understand, is very much frowned upon. So in other countries, the practice is definitely submitting multiple offers if you can, and then just going with the one you like best or the one that was accepted the quickest. Here it's generally expected that if you have submitted an offer and the offer has been accepted, you'll only be pulling back due to due diligence related reasons. So for example, if you found out in the official documentation, you found out that something is not exactly as you expected it with registration or zoning or boundaries. If you conduct a structural inspection and you find some significant damage that you don't think would be surmountable, like termite damage or tilting or sinking, those are all very valid reasons to pull an offer back and not go ahead with the deal. But if you're just going to pull the offer back because you've had a change of heart, you went for another property, you decided not to invest at this time, you got cold feet, whatever the case may be, that particular realtor and government municipality, in case of an Akiya abandoned property, will not be working with us as your representative or with you again. And that also reflects on their image. Again, this is probably the first time they've actually come in contact with a potential foreign buyer. And then that colors the entire experience for them and cements the image that foreigners have here of being tire kickers, because in Japan it's just not done. So we would always ask our clients to shortlist, and we can of course help with the research and shortlisting of a list of properties that they're interested in order of priority, pursue them one at a time, and if we pull back the offer, explain exactly why so that the relationship remains intact. So this is definitely the case if you're purchasing from a real estate company, companies that purchase properties and then later sell them at a profit, either as a renovate and flip or just flip at a slightly higher price. Then they will provide up to 2 years of warranty for any unseen faults. If you're buying from an individual, it's not the default mode. If you're buying a very cheap property, it's usually a case of take it as it is, and it's expected that there's going to be stuff that you need to repair and renovate. If the property is slightly more expensive, then we can definitely try to insert a warranty or responsibility clause into the contract. But then it's, even if the seller does agree, it's not going to be for a year or two, it's going to be for 3, maybe 6 months at most. It obviously varies depending on location and size of the land, as well as the age and condition of the property. So closer to larger metropolitan centers will be more expensive regardless of condition. A larger land plot will be more expensive, again, regardless of condition. But otherwise, generally speaking, we normally see properties that are 8 to 10 million yen and over. So let's call it 70 to 90,000 US dollars and over. And of having a higher probability of not needing major renovations. Anything under that, in the few tens of thousands and definitely in the few thousands of dollars per property, are going to take some very major work in the vast majority of cases. We have been pleasantly surprised at times, but that's definitely the exception, not the norm. That very much depends on the local community and what exposure they've had or haven't had to foreigners in the past. In Japan specifically, generally speaking, the Japanese tend to be quite insular. They're not used to, the foreigner population in Japan is a lot lower than it would be in many other countries, even around Asia. Most people are not used to dealing with foreigners unless they come from a relatively big or internationally friendly city. When you're looking at these countryside properties, it really depends. So the sellers are normally happy to just take their money and finish the transaction, especially if they're going to be moving away to another community and following the sale. If the seller remains in the community, or if the community members, as a rule, have never experienced or dealt with a foreigner in the past, it can vary a lot. They would be definitely surprised to see you there. Whether that will translate into curiosity and communication, or aloofness and hostile looks around their shoulder, really depends on the community. Some of them are very close-knit. So even the government authority or the real estate agent who is communicating with you prior to the sale in those cases would advise you to maybe reconsider, because the community is very insular. And that's not necessarily specifically related to foreigners. They can be equally hostile to people coming in just from another city in Japan. So there are two aspects to research and review there. The first is, what are the local municipality regulations on short-term stay properties? Some ward offices in Tokyo, for example, who are very open to tourism, are more lenient. Some little tourist towns who want to increase economy via tourism are more lenient, but others are very strict. Neighbors and local community members don't want to see, again, too many strangers coming in and out of the town, and then they would be more strict. They would necessitate, for example, a staff member being always on hand, either at the property or close to it, not to run it during the weekends, not to run it during public holidays, not to run it in close proximity to public facilities like a nursing home or a school or a kindergarten. So it very much varies. Once we've established what local ward office regulations are in one particular area, we can then look at individual properties, but then the other challenge becomes who's going to manage it for you. So short-term stay regulations in Japan require either a staffer on hand at the property or close to it, or alternatively a licensed management company within a certain distance from the property. In those rural areas where a lot of the cheaper properties are located, there are just simply no management companies available. So unless you're going to be living in the property and running the short-term stay operation yourself, or alternatively hiring somebody to do it for you who can be at the property or close to it, it's going to be very difficult, near impossible. So the challenges there are usually related to mismatched expectations on both ends. So the Japanese side, again, as discussed previously, are used to things going by the book. They're not used to people coming in, waving loads of cash, submitting multiple offers, and then deciding which one to go for. They're not even used to being asked too many questions and for too many terms and conditions to put into the contract. Usually, property purchases in Japan are very straightforward. There's a listing, there's a price, you might slightly negotiate it, maybe 10-15%, maybe conduct a structural inspection, which is rare for these older, cheaper properties, and the deal is done. But foreigners who are coming into Japan are obviously used to a different mode of operation. In many cases, if they come into another country and they're a cash purchaser, they're going to be an army of real estate agents and available properties, and everybody wants to work with them. Everything moves very smoothly and quickly. The moment they submit an offer, it's accepted. 2 days later, they can get the documents. It just doesn't work that way here. And the more rural and cheaper the property is, the more slow everything is going to take. The less motivated sellers are. In many cases, it's just a property that's been in the family for ages, and it's the government pushing the seller to sell it. It's not going to be as smooth and as quick and as open arms as you'd expect it to be, whether in your country of residence or other countries that you purchased in the past. So we normally tell our customers, number one, to buckle in, it's going to be a long haul. They might look at 5, 10, 15, 20 different properties before they actually find the one that they're going to go ahead with. And even then, every stage of the process, again, the more rural, the cheaper the property, the more likely everything will take much longer. Everything will be a lot more vague until we can clarify and put everything down in writing. Documents will be amended, re-amended, sent again. Documents will have to be reproduced. Everything will take much, much longer. So definitely not a good idea to send us a list of properties and say, I'm coming in 2 months and I want everything to be settled by then. It's just not going to happen. You need to evaluate the properties one by one, see how long the projected process is going to take, and then start planning your first visit to the property. If you do it in advance, you're going to end up being frustrated and disappointed, and that's going to be the case if you expect things to move at the same pace or at the same smoothness that they do overseas. It just does not. Everything is by the book, everything is legal, everything will eventually happen, but it will take time, and it's going to be more complicated, and there's going to be much more fiddliness to it than you're used to overseas. So again, buckle in, enjoy the ride. It's not going to be a fast process by any means.